The first part of the lecture will be the conclusion of my totem pole lecture. And this actually is a very important, it fits very nicely into the next theme, which is contemporary ceremonialism, because what I'm going to show you for the next few minutes are totem poles that have been made by native carvers to express native issues. And many of these issues have to do with politics. Just to summarize, a totem pole before contact with non-natives and throughout much of the 19th century was a carving erected in front of a house of an extended family of a clan, and it declared the history of the clan and the status of the clan. That's pretty much what a totem pole was. It was an expression of family identity. And as you'll see, the totem pole now is not so much or always a signifier of family identity. It is now a signifier of nativeness, of sovereignty. It is useful in land claims, and it also has to do with a great deal of cultural revival. That's okay. The first place we're going to go to see about cultural revival would be Haida Gwaii, and visit the Haida Heritage Center at Sea Lion Town, which is called Kwal-Nagai, but that's probably more than you need to know. This is a huge project that was sponsored by the tribe, by the federal Canadian government, by the provincial government, by corporate funds. And it is a project that is for many different, it was made for many different reasons. Let's go back to the 19th century. This is a slide of Skidegate, which is in Haida Gwaii on the Queen Charlotte Islands in the ocean off the coast of British Columbia. This is the classic photograph, this is 1876, of totem poles, houses, large plank houses, canoes that are made of single cedar logs that are ocean-going canoes. And this is the stereotypical image of the Northwest Coast and the totem pole. As I said last time, the Haida were very progressive, and by progressive, historians mean the group wanted to bring in the missionaries, they wanted to bring in the teachers, they wanted to convert, they wanted to stop their potlatches. Potlatches were great feasts that celebrated the heritage of the family, basically. And so the Haida stopped making houses like this, stopped carving totem poles by the 1880s. And for literally an entire century, there were no poles carved in among the Haida. Well, if you go to the same beach, see, this is on a beach, and here's the ocean. If you're looking at it this way, the beach, this is what you see today. A whole line of plank houses, each of which has a totem pole in front of it. Over here is the cultural center, where many items that have been repatriated have been placed. I will go more deeply into repatriation in a few minutes. And this whole assemblage has a carving center, a restaurant, a performance space, an exhibition space, classrooms, language programs. The archives have many, many Haida language songs, orations, and so on tape, or whatever the new technology is. And the elders can come and listen. Young people come to this site to renew their knowledge of their culture. Dancing lessons are given. It's a whole cultural expression of the Haida regeneration. The group and this is really important to think, this particular group did not maintain its ceremonialism throughout the 20th century. But this is an extremely impressive, this is the most impressive and large-scale Northwest Coast native cultural, architectural statement that we have. And it's not surprising, it's the Haida, because the Haida have always been very strong and very assertive about what it was they wanted. In this case, they want their culture to be displayed. The other aspect of this, and I mentioned this when in the totem pole lecture, is that totem poles are also an important vehicle for tourism. Tourists come to Alaska to look at the totem poles. Tourists come to British Columbia to look at the totem poles. This is a tourist attraction. Unfortunately, Haida Gwaii is on an island that is a several-hour ferry ride away from the mainland, and to get to where the mainland is requires a couple days' drive. So it's not that easy to get to, but if any of you are going in that general direction, this is absolutely worth the trip. And here's a slide of the one of the houses, several of the houses, each with a totem pole in front of them. And what's interesting about these totem poles is that in the past, as I said, the totem pole was an indicator of a family. Well, what they decided to do, what the people creating this village, this little village, decided to do was to not have a family, but to have the poles represent an entire community, an entire village. And so the images, the crests on these poles represent the crests from all the different clans of the community, which is a complete new concept. You never would have had different family crests on the same pole. But here it was acceptable, and the point being that some of the old rules have been significantly modified in order to make masterpieces such as this. I just happen to love this slide. This is a slide of looking out to the bay. You know, you're right here in Sea Lion Town, and you're looking out, and this was one of the extraordinarily few sunny days on Haida Gwaii. It usually rains. And then here is the inside of the carving shed. They make totem poles, and this is their ocean-going canoe that they made. And they will take, for a fee, they will take you out paddling around in this very large canoe, which holds about 25 people. These are really huge canoes. So this is another example of their interest in culture, their interest in maintaining their identity, and their interest in making money from tourists. It's all very, very interconnected. And the other thing about the Haida is that they managed to get the name of their island changed. This used to be Queen Charlotte Islands, but now the official name on the Canadian official name is Haida Gwaii, which means land of the Haida. So they are very strong people. That's happening right now. Let me just go back a little bit in time, because I also wanted to show you some examples of monumental carvings that communicate land ownership. The problem with British Columbia and Alaska is that there were very few treaties made by the settlers with Alaskan and British Columbian natives. I don't think there were any treaties in Alaska. There were a few in British Columbia. And so the settlers just confiscated land right and left, confiscated, sort of started fishing in the creeks that were the family's possessions. And so an ongoing problem in Canada, and it has been solved in Alaska to an extent, is the problem of land ownership. And in British Columbia, there are ongoing treaty negotiations between each tribe and the Canadian government and the British Columbia government about what kind of land they can claim and what the payment is for the land that they confiscated in the past. And it's a very lengthy, extremely complicated legal procedure, but several groups have actually had treaties determined. And so this is an ongoing problem. It has not been resolved yet by any means, but at least the Canadian government is listening and the British Columbia government is listening, which they didn't do. Well, the British Columbia didn't listen for many, many years. But we go back to the 1930s. The city of Vancouver wanted to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the first sighting of Vancouver Island, which is on the coast, which is right near, They wanted to celebrate the anniversary of the sighting of the city of Vancouver land by Captain Vancouver. And so they said, let's have a totem pole here. And they asked a local Salish Indian, Chief Matthias Joe, who is also sometimes called Chief Matthias Joe Capilano. And they said, could you please put a totem pole up here? And he said, sure. And this is actually a Kwakwaka'wakw style totem pole. It is not a Salish style totem pole, but this is what he did with the wings outstretched. And you've seen, those of you last time, you've seen this totem pole many times in many variations. Well, what the Vancouver City Fathers were totally unaware of is that the message behind this pole, the message that is being expressed in the figures on the pole, is that Captain Vancouver stole our land. This is my clan's land. I own this. My family owns this. This is a statement of sovereignty, of land claims, of attempted control over the land that they want. So I just think this is a wonderful example of this was in 1936, so that was a really long time ago. But the Salish have always claimed a lot of the different areas in Vancouver City. And that is still an ongoing land claim dispute, and eventually that will be solved in one way or another. But this is one of the first. So now the Native people are taking this tradition of family declarations of status and property and now taking it and putting it into signifying the entire area. And this is, if you come to the international arrivals at Vancouver International Airport, you go down an escalator, and right at the bottom of the escalator, before you get to the customs, you'll see these two poles, and they're each about, I think about 15 feet tall. They are by a woman, Susan Point. She's a contemporary Salish carver. She made these in about 2000. And these are Salish-style welcome figures. Susan Point belongs to the Musqueam band of the Salish. And her band has claim to the property that the airport is on. So when you're coming down the escalator, you are being welcomed, not by the Canadian government, not by the city of Vancouver, but by greeting figures from the tribe that claims that land. And so they're being very gracious. They're saying, welcome to our property, welcome to our land. There's no aggression in here, but it's a very firm statement. And what's interesting is that when the airport was built, they knew what this meant. They wanted to do it because many cultures want to have better partnerships with their indigenous people, and this is one of them. So if you fly into Vancouver International Airport, you will see the man and the woman welcoming you to Musqueam, Salish land. The Kwakwaka'wakw have always had a very strong sense of themselves, as you know, a very strong sense of identity. They they potlatched for decades, even when the potlatch was declared illegal. And if you go to Alert Bay, which is the most popular town populous town of the Kwakwaka'wakw, you'll see the cemetery. It's on a hill, and there are many totem poles, some standing, some having fallen down. The ones that are fallen down, they most of the time don't put them back up. The reason being, and I'll just repeat this, is that when you erect a totem pole, the family whose pole it is sponsors a lavish feast called a potlatch. And you give away a huge amount of food, and you give away gifts. And the potlatch is the ceremony that is so significant. The pole, once it's up, it doesn't mean that much. It's the memory of the potlatch that happened during the elevation of the pole. So some of these poles are not ever going to be fixed. But the problem is, of course, Alert Bay is really on a main tourist route. And so a lot of tourists come. Well, this may not sound like a big deal, but it really is. Here is a pole, a memorial pole for a deceased person who died maybe 10, 15 years ago. And it says, Namgi's burial ground, to be viewed from the street only. That's really important because the Kwakwaka'wakw are finally saying, you can't come onto this property. It used to be that people would trample all over the graveyard, take things away from the poles, and now they're asserting their authority over their land. Here's another really interesting, this does not really qualify as a totem pole, but I think it's quite interesting anyway. Rich Beasley is a Tlingit from Juneau, Alaska, and he has created living carvings in trees. This is a nice big tree, and what he's done is he's carved the tree itself into a figure. This is the head, the body, the legs. And I have another one, a different one, which is a little bit easier to see. Yeah, and here he has a face, beautiful face. I mean, he's an exquisite carver. Why he did this was he wanted to say, this is our land. In the past, sometimes his ancestors would mark trees to delineate where their property line was. And he said, I want, because this is in Mount Roberts, which is a beautiful trail through the woods in Juneau, up in the hills. And he wanted to say, I want everyone to know this is our land, this is Tlingit land. And so he's taking a old style designation of property and now putting it in a new context. And this is actually my personal favorite. If you're in Juneau, this is a building that celebrates the centennial of Alaska. And this is a pole by Nathan Jackson, whom you'll see actually in the next couple of slides, and Steve Brown. And they made this pole to celebrate the centennial of Alaska. Well, what's interesting is that if you look at the pole, it's very tall, but at the very, very top is a carving of Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam is the symbol of the United States, the symbol of the United States government. And why is that? Well, back in the 19th century, the American Navy bombed a village of Tlingit people. It turns out that a Tlingit had died on a whaling ship, and therefore you have to have an eye for an eye, and the Tlingit killed somebody from the whaling ship company, and the soldiers were called in, and instead of negotiating a proper peace, which could have been done by exchanging blankets, it could have been done by exchanging blankets, the Navy bombed the village and burned it. And this pole tells that story. And the message is the United States government has still not apologized to that village for bombing them. So you go to Juneau. This was a pole that was commissioned by the Alaska state government. And yet Nathan and Steve said, this is a story we're going to tell, and everyone going by can see that this is something that still has not been done. And at this point, all they really want is an official apology from the United States Navy, and that has still not happened. So anyway, for those of us from Alaska, we should worry about that. Then I just wanted to show you this because it shows the extent of what poles are used for. In Sitka, this is also Tlingit, there is a pole, now they're called the Wellbriety pole. And there's a national Native sobriety movement. As you doubtless know, alcohol is a very serious problem with Native communities. And this is a national from all the 48 states. They came to Tlingit land, and there was a carver who was a recovering alcoholic, and he agreed to carve a pole, and every week new people would come in to help him carve the pole. And carving the pole included a pledge not to drink. So then when it was elevated, it is now in a very prominent place, and it contains images that reflect on the notion that health is important and people should cease drinking, and that kind of message. So now we have a very different kind of message. Today, Native people are using totem poles for a huge variety of different purposes. And so the story continues. But what's really interesting about the poles that I've shown you thus far is that these are poles, despite the fact who paid for them, it doesn't matter, that are expressing important social and political issues. Then we come upon another kind of pole, and this is the poles that relate to the Harriman expedition. In 1899, a railroad magnate by the name of something or other Harriman hired a steamship and brought a lot of scientists to Alaska on a scientific expedition. They went to the Bering Sea, they collected all kinds of specimens, and then they stopped by what they thought was an abandoned village called Gash. And this is the entire Harriman expedition on the beach at Gash. And notice that there are a lot of totem poles in the back. Well, what they did is they chopped most of them down and brought them to the boat that they were on, and then distributed them to the universities that the people, the scientists on the ship were from. And two of them, this one and another one, there's a house post, and there was another one on the other side, went to the Burke Museum at the University of Washington. And it represents the man who married the bear and then was dismembered. He was torn apart. In 1990, the United States government passed the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. And NAGPRA dictated that if any item was stolen from a Native community, the museum had to give it back. If there were human remains from Native communities, the museum had to give them back. And there were several other kinds of materials that had to be given back. Repatriation became the law in the United States. And so the polls that had been taken in the Harriman expedition began going back to the communities. And there was actually, in the early 2000s, a reenactment of the Harriman expedition, a tourist reenactment of the Harriman expedition. And the ship that the tourists were on brought one of the house posts from the Burke Museum to Ketchikan, where it is now in safekeeping. And here is a member of the clan whose house post it was, welcoming it, and there was a lot of ceremony. It was fabulous. I wasn't there, unfortunately, but it was, by all accounts, an absolutely fabulous event. So what we have now is a lot of repatriation, things going back to the communities. And what the Tlingit did is they said, well, these museums are being very nice, giving us our treasures back. We would like at least to give you a log that you can have carved into a new totem pole. And so the Burke Museum did that, but there were two of these house posts, so they got two logs. And one of the logs was made into a house post that looks very, very similar to the original. This is by Nathan Jackson, once again, the premier Tlingit traditional carver of this time. It represents a bear, and here is the image of the man who married the bear. It's very much like the previous work. It's very much like the previous work, although there of course are some differences. But Nathan is a kind of carver that likes to make work that is very much like the work of his ancestors. Nathan's son's name is Stephen Jackson. And this is what Stephen did. This is the so-called pole that Stephen made. It's not wood, it's made out of epoxy, which is a kind of plastic stuff. And what it is, and here's a detail of this part here. Stephen is using form line images. He's got ovoids, U-forms, ovoids, form lines, but has completely pulled them in different directions and made this swirling mass of energy and vitality that you certainly don't see in his father's work or in much 19th century Tlingit work. It's usually much more staid than this. And what you have here in this detail is, look at this is a hand. Well, these are fingers. The body in there has been literally dismembered, as in the story. This is, and this is intentional, by the way, this is, Stephen told me this. This is an intestine with a hole in it. And if you look very carefully at the various different parts, it is a shocking but very impressive piece of work. It is the translation of the form line style into something completely new and different. And next week I'm going to be talking a lot more about artists such as this. Just as an aside, when I was giving a series of lectures in a small native town in Alaska, a native Tlingit town, and I showed this slide, and the women in the class were horrified, and they said, "Oh my God, Nathan, the father, must be so embarrassed by his son." And I said the truth, which was that no, Nathan is incredibly proud of his son. And then I quickly changed the subject because not everybody likes to change Northwest Coast art quite as dramatically as this. But this is an entree into the kind of art that we're doing, that people today are doing. Some people are doing very, what we call traditional art, and some people are doing very innovative art. Okay, well, this now segues into the other topic of today's class, which is 20th century ceremonialism. The point of this class is to demonstrate that some cultures on the coast maintained their ceremonial traditions very, very actively and obviously, and that would be the Kwakwaka'wakw. They were right in your face for much of the century. Not all of it, but much of it. Then we have the Tlingit, who, if you read any of the books and any of the articles about Tlingit ceremonies in the 20th century up until the 1980s, there was nothing. No ceremonies, nothing happening. The Haida, of course, actually did cease their ceremonies, but in the late 20th century, they revived them in a way analogous to the revival in Sea Lion Town. And then at the end, I will show you an extraordinary example of what's going on today by giving you slides of a Tsimshian wedding that contains both native and non-native components. And I want to say that my friend Patty Kostelik was on the trip to the wedding with me, and we will have an example of her fabulous photographs at the end of the class. So, let's go to the Kwakwaka'wakw. The Canadian government outlawed the potlatch in the 1880s. It was against the law. The government felt that the potlatch was wasteful. People shouldn't just give away stuff. They should save their material. They shouldn't spend it. They should not have these elaborate dances. They should not have these masked performances. In some tribes, like the Haida, they stopped potlatching anyway. They didn't have a law. They didn't need a law to tell them to stop. The Kwakwaka'wakw said, no, we will not obey your rules. We will not obey your laws. We will continue to potlatch, and they did, with some variations, which I'll show you, and I think I even mentioned this to the first class. Unfortunately, in 1923, a very aggressive Indian agent arrested a good number of people who attended a major potlatch. He gave these people the option: either give up your regalia, your masks, your ceremonial clothing, your coppers, which signify great wealth, or go to jail. Many of the potlatch participants gave up their regalia, and that regalia ended up going to a variety of different museums. The men and women who refused to give up their regalia were sent to jail. And so for the first time ever, you had people jailed for potlatching. After that, the Kwakwaka'wakw were not nearly so overt in their potlatching, but they continued to do it. They really did. And art continued to be made throughout the 20th century. Sometimes, this is actually before the arrest, but in their attempt to avoid the law, this is a so-called flour potlatch. I think I showed you the sugar and biscuit potlatch. This is a flour potlatch. These are sacks of flour, and they would give the flour out and saying, we're helping our hungry fellows. This is not a potlatch. So they indulged in all kinds of subterfuges. And they a lot of times had these things at Christmas time, so that everyone, people give Christmas gifts. Christians give Christmas gifts, why can't we? But the real tragedy, and this was indeed a tragedy in the community, the regalia that the Indian agent confiscated was magnificent. And he actually sold some when a man who was collecting for the National Museum of the Museum of the American Indian in New York came and said, "Oh, I'd like to buy some of them," and he sold them. He had no right to sell them. He was not in any official capacity. It was just not allowed, but he did anyway. So some of the masks went to the National Museum of the American Indian. Some went to the museum in Ottawa. Then in the 1970s, the community said, wait a minute, those masks were confiscated under duress, under threat of jail. And if that was wrong, you need to give them back. And they were finally all returned to the Native Cultural Center in Alert Bay. So all these masks are finally back. You're beginning to see a pattern that we're in the throes of serious repatriation, which of course is one of the reasons why the Kachina mask, the Hopi mask situation that happened a couple of weeks ago was so very interesting to us as me as an American, because such an event would never have happened in the States. So this is a 19th century bird mask. I showed you this before. The beaks of the bird snap open and shut. This, you see the string here, this lowers and the mouth is bright copper. Can you imagine what it would look like in the flickering firelight of the inside of a big house? The copper would really be shining. It's very dramatic. Well, that's a 19th century mask. In the middle of the 20th century, when the potlatch was still illegal, a man by the name of Mungo Martin continued making potlatch masks. And this is one of his amazing masks. It's really big, and you can see the 3 different birds, and they can snap in syncopation. It's an amazing mask. This was made during the time the potlatch was illegal, and supposedly nobody was potlatching, but the point is the Kwakwaka'wakw were continuing to do that. And there were several artists that maintained an active and lively trade in art, masks being made for the community. So in 1951, the Canadian government in its wisdom dropped the anti-potlatch law. And in 1953, there was the first legal potlatch. If you go to Victoria, British Columbia, this is the Royal British Columbia Museum in Victoria. And outside is this big house. It's the Mungo Martin house. Mungo Martin was hired by that museum to carve totem poles like this one. I mentioned that last time about museums hiring native carvers. And this is the house that he built. It represents his family's house. And in 1953, for the opening of this house, he had a major potlatch. It was the first public potlatch that had ever happened in decades. And this is unfortunately an extremely bad photograph of a dancer wearing the mask that you just saw. And this was a 3-day affair where all the masks that had been hidden were brought out, and dances, everyone danced, and it was an amazing event. And since then, the Kwakwaka'wakw have had a huge number of potlatches. There's barely a month that goes by in Alert Bay or another one of the native communities up there that does not have its own potlatch. There is a big house. They're called big houses. That's the name that they give for these large houses. They are big too. And this is the outside of the house. Again, this is not the house of a particular family. It's the house of the whole community. This is the inside of the house. Here are some roof supports. This is where the chiefs sit on these benches. Here is a central fire pit, and you notice that there's an open roof. The fire just goes out, and if it's raining, the rain comes right back in. And this is built specifically to house any number of potlatches that occur constantly in Alert Bay. And I just want to take you through a couple of photographs. This is a photograph of of a potlatch in the 1980s. Notice that you have this very similar bird masks that snap open and shut. That is a popular kind of mask. Here's a more recent mask of this is actually a joking spirit, and these dancers run around actually clowning and being very silly, and everyone's laughing, so that's fun. At the very end of the potlatch, after everything has happened, everyone is invited to dance around the central fire pit, and people sing, and I just wanted to show you this to give you a sense of the space and the interior of the house. And here's another slide of those jokester dancers. Just to bring this art up to the present, the carvers today, the Kwakwaka'wakw carvers today, make some art for commercial sale in the galleries, and they make some art for use in their communities. And this is an extremely interesting sort of art production system. And it can be very much the exact same piece of art, the same looking piece, but one is sold to the community and the other is sold to a dealer. And this is a bee mask from the 1890s, and this mask was wonderful. And here's the detail of the bee mask. The dancer would run around, you would have a whole bunch, like 8, 9, 10 dancers with bee masks coming out, running around the fire pit, just pretending they're stinging people. And again, the Kwakwaka'wakw have a tremendous delight in drama and humor. Some of these events are very humorous. So here is a 19th century bee mask, and here is a 20th century bee mask by a major carver by the name of Tony Hunt. You can see it's very similar with the spikes sticking out of the bee stingers sticking out in a very similar way from the other one. And the dance is virtually the same. So today, if you go to Alert Bay, and if the family who's hosting the potlatch actually has the privilege to make this, to use this mask, because not everybody does, then you might see the bee mask. Another very amusing mask is the fool dancer mask. And here is one that actually is also a dynamic mask. You see, you can raise the eyebrows to show the copper underneath it. It's really weird when they do that. I've seen it in motion. This is the fool dancer mask, and that's actually an extremely interesting concept. Throughout Native America, you have the so-called sacred clown, or did it fall down?
No, just hide it with this.
Okay. The sacred enforcer, the jokester. The Pueblo Indians have masked dancers that perform this same function. Well, in the Kwakwaka'wakw culture, it's the fool dancer, also known as Nuhmal. And what he does, and I apologize for the vulgarity of what I'm going to say, he gets his power from mucus, snot, I don't know, that you probably know what I'm talking about, and during his performance, when he is controlling the people, he will run around, and then if somebody's misbehaving, he will pull wet seaweed out of his nose and throw it onto the misbehaving people. And so this is both funny, because it is funny, but in the olden days, he could also, he also could kill somebody if indeed the misbehavior was significant enough to warrant that. That, of course, is in the land of, is right now in history. Whether or not it's true, nobody knows. But anyway, so this is a Nuhmal mask, and then you can see that they're making it another mask today, and you will have potlatches today where you will have dancers running around pulling disgusting seaweed out of their noses and throwing it at the crowd. The point, of course, being that the Kwakwaka'wakw are extraordinarily proud of the unbroken tradition that they had. And even though they went underground, anyone in the know knew that they were still potlatching, and they had regalia being made throughout the 20th century. Oh, that's right. Oh, okay. I totally. Yes, this is great. This is a very recent mask, which I've actually seen performed. It's a water monster mask. The mask is about this big, and the dancer carries it in front of him, and he will very slowly walk around. He doesn't dance very actively because you can't with something this heavy. These eyes can close and open, so he'll go like this, and then his eyes will close and open, and then go like that and open and close. Then you can see that there's the copper mouth that we saw earlier. He can open up his mouth and have this big copper smile. Then, that is a crystal. This represents a being that had his power from a crystal. That crystal can go down into the hole and then up. So the crystal will rise and there'll be a little flashlight. So the crystal will glow. And I curated an exhibit in collaboration with a Kwakwaka'wakw called the Chiefly Feasts, the Enduring Kwakwaka'wakw Potlatch. And this mask performed at the opening of the exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City in 1991. And what we had, there were hundreds of people there, but in the very closest row to where the performance was happening, we had some teenagers, not teenagers, school children. They were all sitting there, and when this mask came around and opened its eyes, they all went, "Ooh!" It was very effective. It's a very effective kind of drama. At the end of the potlatch, you've seen the piles of blankets that they gave at potlatches, and the boxes of biscuits and flour. Today, everything is full. Plastic laundry baskets are spread all over the floor, and they are filled to the brim with blankets, cooking utensils, towels. Then the host will walk around and give out dollar bills, huge rolls of dollar bills. For very distinguished guests, they will have posts that are covered, that have bracelets on them, and they'll give the bracelets, silver bracelets, to distinguished members of the audience. And a typical potlatch today will cost at least $25,000. The families spend years preparing for these things. And it's the whole extended family. It's not just a nuclear family. But, and I just, my one personal anecdote about this is that the first potlatch I attended in Alert Bay, I had come because I was doing an exhibit on the potlatch, and I wanted to watch a potlatch, obviously. And I was just sitting there being an objective scholar, noticing what was going on, and then this happened. The floor was covered with stuff. So much money was being given out. And without thinking about it, I said, the family who is hosting this potlatch is so important, is so powerful, they are so rich. In other words, it affected me, it worked on me, this distribution of wealth. It was fascinating. So, this was the exhibit that was at the American Museum of Natural History. And these days, when you create an exhibit in the States and in Canada on Native culture, you must bring the Native group into the creation of the exhibit. That is simply the way it's done. So from the very beginning, I invited a team of Kwakwaka'wakw elders and a museum professional to come and help us. And they did come to New York for a week where they went through all the collections. The American Museum has fabulous Kwakwaka'wakw collections. And so they came and we shared the material with them. And what is really interesting is that things happen when you bring Native people into a museum creation that you don't necessarily, you can't possibly predict. This is a triple transformation mask that I believe I showed you in the first class. When it's closed, it represents a fish, then it opens and represents a bird, then it opens again and represents a hero by the name of Suwiti. This mask, as well as an array of other masks, were the possession of a particular family, and they were purchased in the 19th century from that family. One of the elders who came with us to New York, to help us with the exhibit, was a descendant of that family. And here he is, Chief Tom Willey. This is the mask that you just saw, and here are some other masks from that same array of the family, of, the masks owned by a particular family. He stood up, and for half an hour, he orated in Kwakwala, his language, his story of these masks and why his family owned them and what the story was and how these were his masks. And at the end, an assistant went around and handed out dollar bills to everyone there, including the museum staff, because that's the way you do it. You are paying the witnesses for the privilege of having seen this documentation of heritage and wealth. It was really quite remarkable. I think. Just very briefly, the Nuchanoth, I just wanted to show you another example of how potlatching went underground. This is a screen from the Nuchanoth 19th century. I showed you this the first time, and it represents beings that are associated with family. Well, what the Nuchanoth did was, instead of continuing to paint screens on boards, they simply painted their images on muslin, on cotton, and they would simply roll it up. If the Indian agent came, they would roll it up and hide it under the bed, and then when they had a potlatch, they would come out and do it. Okay. Haida, on the other hand, they seized their ceremonial in the late 19th century, as you know, and again, I've shown this photograph many times. In 1880, the missionary said to the Haida ladies in Skidegate, you can wear your regalia one more time, you can paint your faces one more time, and we will take your photograph. This is the very last time you will ever be able to show your regalia and your clan. These are all clan paintings. And so this is a really historical photograph. Well, in 1980, a very talented young man by the name of Robert Davidson raised the first totem pole in Haida Gwaii in 100 years. That was his pole. And he and many young Haida said, we must revive our culture. And so Robert is a fabulous artist and is very, very highly regarded, and his artworks goes for extraordinary amounts of money, deservedly, very modern works. But he also started making masks for ceremonies. There were no historical indications of what the ceremonies were. They literally had stopped having ceremonies in the 1880s. That was even before anthropologists came to study and find out what was Haida all about. So there was no documentation, or very little documentation. So Robert and his family and his friends and the community began creating songs, dances, masquerades, and this is one of Robert's masks that he actually uses at his event, at his performances, and it's a transformation mask. It snaps open and snaps shut. And so Robert, and I'll show his work next time as an example of the contemporary artwork, but Robert also makes a lot of pieces for his performances. And here he is. He's a very handsome man, I must say. He's very handsome. And he makes all his art. He makes his drum. He writes the songs. He writes the music. He invents the dances. And this is the kind of example that I just want you to think about, the difference between the Kwakwaka'wakw and the Haida. The Kwakwaka'wakw looked down on the Haida because they lost it all. They had to reinvent it. Some people who, non-natives who look, say, well, this is all invented. It's not authentic. Now, if you watch a Robert Davidson performance and hear the songs and hear the depth of feeling that they express while they are singing, while they are dancing, there is no way that anyone can say this is not authentically native. It's just different. It's something new, something different, but this is as much Haida, contemporary Haida, as the potlatches that I just showed you are contemporary Kwakwaka'wakw. And I just also wanted to show you, a handsome man deserves a very beautiful wife. This is Robert's wife, Terry Lynn, who is dancing with a drum that he painted. And here are she weaves the hats, and they are singing. There's a whole troupe, and they perform. And the word performance, I think, is just something of a misnomer because it's them sharing their culture with people in various walks of life. And it's quite remarkable. Terry Lynn, in addition to being lucky enough to be Robert Davidson's wife and being very beautiful and being an incredible singer, I'm sure she had voice lessons at some point. She also is a very important lawyer. She is the chief lawyer for the Haida land claims. So the Haida, they're really incredible people. When they throw themselves into something, they really do it incredibly well. And so I wanted to share, the juxtaposition between the Haida and the Kwakwaka'wakw would be, I think, quite different. Now we go to the Tlingit, who live in Alaska again. The Tlingit potlatch was a memorial to the deceased in particular. It was a way to say goodbye to distinguished family members. And at the potlatch, the Tlingit potlatch, the clan that hosted the potlatch would invite people from the opposite half to be participants and witnesses in the potlatch. And the potlatch was frowned upon by the government. What the Americans did not like it. The missionaries really hated it. And so in 1904, the then governor declared that there was going to be a last potlatch and no more potlatches were ever going to happen again. And this didn't really work. Although everyone thought that was the last potlatch, in truth, it wasn't. So let's just go back. This is a very early a Russian drawing of a potlatch in the 1880s. It's a funerary potlatch. This is a deceased chief who is laid out as part of the funeral. He's laid out in state for 4 days with all his regalia surrounding him. And there are hosts and there are guests, and they sing and they perform with each other and to each other, and they feast and they give away a lot of goods. This is a somewhat dramatic, but I think still revealing reenacted or sort of an attempt to show what a potlatch was like in the 19th century in actually the whale house of Cluck-Wan. I've shown this particular slide of that screen a couple times in this class. And here you have dancers wearing various masks, wearing frontlets, beating drums, wearing chilkat robes. And the Tlingit potlatch was the opportunity for a great display of clan regalia. And for the Tlingit, the regalia has innate power, not supernatural power, but the regalia embodies the ancestors. The crest embodies the history. And the more time an item of regalia, such as this mask, this big, large, oversized mask, is presented at a potlatch, and wealth is distributed, it is revalidated and its power becomes even greater. So, and this is not every Northwest Coast group has this particular notion of an item getting greater and greater power the more times it's displayed. But the Tlingit, that's very central to Tlingit mentality. And so when you presented your regalia, you would talk about it, you would talk about the history, you would orate, the notion of oration, great speeches with passion and intensity is another tradition of the Tlingit. So I just want to show you, this is what they're very colorful. Unfortunately, most of the slides are black or white. And here is a potlatch that happened in 1890, and once again, chilkat robes, rattles, helmets, hats, and so on. It was the opportunity to really show your whole clan history by wearing the regalia that embodied that clan history. And some of the dances were great fun. Here you have two men crouching down with sort of like knife type things in their mouths. And the movements of men were very, very jerky and energetic, and they bounced up and down. Women were very graceful. The women and the men both danced, and women had grace and the men had much more intense movements. A very interesting study is the study of dance at the potlatches. I am not a dance person, so I could not do that, but somebody who actually knows about dance would find the difference in the male-female dance and different clan dances very interesting. And sometimes, if you are a member of like the Raven clan, you would wear a regalia and run around as if you were a raven and yell raven calls or. Okay. Fast forward to 1900. Governor Brady is a man that has much to do with the history of Northwest Coast art. Governor Brady was the governor of Alaska at the turn of the century, and he was the man who requested a large number of totem poles from Tlingit and Haida villages in southeast Alaska and brought them first to the St. Louis World's Fair, and then to the Portland World's Fair. And then they went back to Sitka, where he set up the Sitka National Historical Park. And this is a slide of the totem pole in the forest. You walk through the forest, and there's these beautiful poles emerge from the woods. And here is a shot of looking at the sea from behind a totem pole. So Governor Brady was very, very concerned about Alaska Natives and their culture. So he said he understood that there were still some payments that had to be made for various activities. I mean, in other words, if you are a member of one clan, it is your obligation to bury a member of the other clan. If you are a member of one clan, you have to marry somebody from the other clan. It's exogamy. And so, but you had to pay them. There had to be payment made. And the payment had to be very ritualized. And Governor Brady was aware at that point that there was a lot of unpaid debts that had to be paid. And he said, okay, let's have a last potlatch, a big potlatch in Sitka in 1904. We will have all the debts paid for, and everything will then be final. We don't have to have an anti-potlatch law, but everyone's going to agree to stop potlatching. So the Tlingit hired a professional photographer, a professional white photographer, to document this whole several-day affair. They actually were embracing a new form of technology as part of their whole systematic display of their treasures. And that documentation formed a very important part of the entire history of each item that was displayed and paid for at that time. So here you have a group of very, very elaborately dressed men and women, and a canoe is coming in with another group of elaborately coiffed and decorated and clothed men and women to be welcomed, and they sing songs of welcome to each other. Then in front of every house where there was a potlatch, the professional photographer would take a slide of the entire clan. So here you have, and it's really interesting, everyone is wearing robes, blankets, headdresses. They're all painted. You have dance staves. You have items that were displayed at the dances that were treasures. And there's a whole array of these wonderful photographs that show in great detail all of the materials that were still owned by the Tlingit at that time. There's a lot of regalia there. Well, what happened after those 1904 potlatches is that the young people who had not really experienced very many potlatches up until that point said, hey, this is really interesting. This has been a lot of fun. And potlatching began to happen more overtly as a result of the 1904 last potlatch. It was a complete reversal of what the government was hoping for. At the same time, there was a group that was formed called the Alaska Native Brotherhood. It was established in 1912, which is somewhat later than the last potlatch. But it was established by Christian Tlingit. And what was happening at that time in Alaska was the same thing that was happening throughout the nation, which was that the Tlingit were subjected to severe discrimination. They couldn't go to school. They couldn't go to the white schools. They couldn't go to any schools. There were no schools for them. There was segregation. There were signs outside of restaurants saying no dogs or Indians allowed. The land had been confiscated from them. There were a lot of other serious problems, and the Alaska Native Brotherhood was formed to combat the problems of discrimination in Alaska. And they, like the Haida, felt that in order to succeed in making Native people equal to whites, this was a civil rights attempt, that in order to do that, the Native people had to give up their traditions, because it was believed then, as the Haida did across the ocean, or across the Sound, that maintaining traditions kept you behind. They embraced the notion that civilized people don't potlatch, they don't dance, they don't wear regalia, and they don't do the kinds of things that their ancestors did. And they also said assimilation is the only way. You could not speak Tlingit at their meetings. you would be fined if you spoke Tlingit. And actually, at the end of this whole process, they actually did succeed in getting the right to vote, which they hadn't had, and that's really an important right, as you can well imagine. Children could finally attend schools, and then they also had workman's compensation, which was not, Indians did not get workman's compensation if they were hired for a job, and if they fell off the ladder and hurt themselves, it was just too bad. And then later on, the Alaska Native Brotherhood and the Alaska Native Sisterhood managed to make the legal discrimination and segregation illegal. So Alaska banned segregation in the 40s, which is well before the United States banned segregation in the 60s. So the Alaska Native Brotherhood had this philosophy. And if you look at the meeting of the Alaska Native Brotherhood, the only way you can tell that these people are in any way Native is that look at their faces, and then they have the band saying A and B, which is only a Native person would wear the band A and B, signifying the Alaska Native Brotherhood. But what was really interesting is that the Brotherhood could not get rid of the traditions. And so at the meetings, if something needed to be done, the person had to ask his opposite to do it. In other words, if he needed to have a vote made, he had to ask his opposite, please make the vote or call the vote. That was so central to their sense of identity that they began doing this back and forth way of addressing your opposites. There was formal terms. Then what they did is that when somebody was deceased, the family would have a verbal memorialization, verbal talks about the great family, the great man. And then what you would usually do in the past would be to give money to your opposites. Instead of giving money to your opposites, you gave it to the Alaska Native Brotherhood. So the Alaska Native Brotherhood became the generic opposite of everybody. Then what I really loved is that if you spoke Tlingit, you would have to pay a fine. So if you wanted to speak Tlingit, you spoke Tlingit and you gave money to the Brotherhood. That was a way of collecting money. Then another thing that they began doing, this happened fairly soon after the Brothers started, they would bring their clan treasures into the Brotherhood meeting and put them on the table and speak Tlingit and give money to the witnesses, i.e. the Alaska Native Brotherhood, and pay the fine for having shown their regalia and having spoken in Tlingit. And so the reason I'm sort of carrying on a little bit about this is that what the Tlingit were doing is that on the outside it looked like their traditions were finished, but that was totally not true. And if you asked an A and B member, he would say, oh, we don't do any ceremonialism. They were doing ceremonialism, but they figured this was right. Okay, so here's another slide of the A and B group that shows how very, very American they look. Well, potlatching and dancing continued. This is a slide on the inside of somebody's house in a village called Yakutat, and it was 1920. And you can see that these people are wearing regalia. This man is dancing. He's shaking a rattle. This is probably people composed of people who are enthusiastic supporters of the Alaska Native Brotherhood. In 1940, there was a clan house that was opened. It was part of the Public Works Administration projects to put Indians at work during the Depression, and this house and these poles were new as part of that project, and it was erected at that point. Well, the chief of this village, Chief Shakes, had a huge potlatch that was attended by the governor and lots of other people. And lots of wealth was given away. This was also people who were Alaska Native Brotherhood supporters. But this was a moment where there was a new clan house. Of course you had to have a potlatch. Things began to change even more in the 30s and 40s because that's when the A&B was really trying very hard to win more court battles, and they needed money. Well, how do you raise money? You put on performances. The A&B began sponsoring performances of dances. And this is in 1936. Here is the A&B logo. And here you're presenting your Chilkat robes, you're playing your drum, you're dancing, they're singing. It is a way of making money, and they learned that these were very, very effective ways of raising money. So despite assimilation, despite all the other things, what was going on is this was a great way to raise money, and dances were great. And here is another group of A&B performers in a fundraiser in the 1940s. Well, the A&B began slowly beginning to realize in the 60s and the 70s that this was really, their old-fashioned attitudes about assimilation were not really very wise. So they began sponsoring dance troupes so that the young people could learn the proper dances. And this is a dance troupe from the 60s. It's an extended family, and they had elders training them about what the right dances were, what the right steps were, and so on. And here's another dance troupe from the 1880s. They were beginning to get more and more community dance troupes assembled. Well, in 1980, the A&B and other Native rights organizations said, we really have to celebrate our culture. And in 1980, they formed the so-called celebration. The celebration is an every 2-year event where literally thousands of people in regalia from the whole Southeast region and some from outside the region come and perform. And this is the very first celebration, 1982. And I love this because you've got this very old man who is wearing regalia. And this might be one of the first times he has actually done this in public like this, because the celebration, you had dance troupes performing in front of huge numbers of people. And there were not that many people in 82, but now there's a parade down the main street for the opening. Susan, you were at one, you remember that? And it is dazzling, all of the regalia. And now so many people are sewing button blankets, making regalia. And I just want to take you through some shots because it's very, very colorful. Active dancing, and they each half an hour for 3 days, you have another dance troupe from another community performing dances, singing. They very often bring their children up on stage. It is quite remarkable. Here's another slide of a dancer behind a sheet, which is one of the particular kinds of treasures that family has. More dancers. The movements, I wish I had a movie, because you really, it's hard to imagine. What this is called the peace dance. They put eagle down into the headdresses. The headdress has a hollow at the top, and then they move like this, and the eagle dam comes out, and that is a gesture of peace. You can see how you have Chilkat robes and sort of raven's tails robes. The weaving that's going on the coast today is just extraordinary. Very energetic man. And at the last day, you can see how many people are in the audience. It's amazing. Thousands of people, and it happens every 2 years. And so this is the way that the Tlingit today have maintained their traditions throughout. and are now have an event that is both celebratory for cultural pride, for aesthetics, for actually declaring that they're important in this region, and also tourism, because it always happens in June when there are a lot of people in Juneau, tourists in Juneau. Oh, and the other thing I just wanted to show you is that the notion of potlatching continues very strong. It's usually called a party now. For whatever reason, they're called parties by the Tlingit. And this is a slide of a party in 2000. You have all the regalia from the clan. It's amazing. There's so much. And it's only shown at these events. And the fact that each one of these is shown and money is distributed means that each one of these becomes more and more powerful. And some of these people who are sitting there are on the board of directors of the corporation. They make lots of money. They're lawyers, they're doctors. But this is still such an important part of who they are in Southeast Alaska. Okay, now this is going to be just fun. Just lots of pretty slides. I have nothing much to say, but in 2010, Michael Askren and Mike D'Angeli were married there at Tsimshian. Michael is a PhD student at the University of British Columbia. She's getting a PhD in art history, the first Northwest Coast Native person ever to get a PhD in art history, and we're looking forward to her moving along in the field. She's almost finished. And Mike D'Angeli is a great artist, and they are a fabulous couple. And the wedding took place in New Metlakatla, and it was a 2-day ceremony. This 2-day event is the most perfect intercultural activity that I can imagine. It communicates so much of what I've been trying to talk about the last couple of classes. These are all Patty's slides, and I thank you, Patty, for taking these great slides. This is Michael, who is also exquisitely beautiful. And she is wearing what seems to be a fairly conventional white dress. And so she looks like a regular, normal bridesmaid. It turns out that embroidered on the dress in light blue, so it's not really very obvious, is her crest. So just like other people who wear chilkat robes and wear items that declare their crest, her wedding dress had it, but it's a white tile-style wedding dress. The priest was or is a Tsimshian minister, and so you can see he's wearing a headdress that declares his clan, and he's wearing this fabulous Northwest Coast style tie, formline tie. And I think he gave the ceremony in Tsimshian, didn't he? Yeah. This is Mike D'Angeli, the artist, and this is Michael, and here's bridesmaids. It was also totally color coordinated. It was light blue, teal and light blue and white. I mean, it was, you even when you went to the wedding, you had, I don't know whether you do this in France, but you can get these little favors that are indicative of the wedding colors, and it was totally created like any other kind of wedding. It was just fabulous. But there was always a little bit of nativeness in here. This is a copper. A copper is a plate of beaten copper, a shield of beaten copper that embodies great wealth. Among the Kwakwaka'wakw, 1 copper could be worth 10,000 blankets, for example. And what part of the ceremony is they gave each other coppers. They exchanged coppers, which is something that they would have done in the old days. And so that is, as the wedding is being like a very normal wedding, all of a sudden you have this copper exchange. There were native songs. This is one of the singers who came with her robes and her drum, and she sang. And here's another group of men singing as the wedding party is going by, and they're singing at Tsimshian. I just wanted to show you, this is, I just love this. Little bridesmaids, the two dogs came and they were wearing bows that had the wedding colors. The bows had wedding colors. And here are the happy bride and groom. Now, I went to this wedding for two reasons. One is that I've been sort of a mentor to Machiel because I met her when she was in high school, so I've known her for years and years and years. The other reason I went is that I'm a baker, and I made her wedding cake. And so, and Patty, I needed to bring my assistant with me, so Patty came and helped me put this wedding cake together. Notice it's with form line design. It is so hard to make form line fondant. Let me tell you, it is just about the hardest thing, and it just, you know, I was horrified because it wasn't perfect, and Mike designed the design, and he sent me the design that he wanted on the wedding cake. And that's the same, you know, modification of that design. You got the that's their wedding symbol. And it was extremely nerve-wracking because Michael is one of the best artists around, and there I have, it wasn't perfect, the lines weren't right, the form line wasn't balanced, but anyway, they seemed to be very happy with it. And there you can see them, they're about to cut the cake. And they also had at the top M&M, because it was Mike and Machiel. And they had M&Ms were candy with little M's and M's on the candy, and they gave them out as favors. Okay, so this was day one. The next day, Patty and I are walking around, and then we see this line of women with regalia and with various other items that they're carrying, and they're walking to the, what was the building? Was it the school? Community center, walking to the community center. And in the community center, where where the wedding party had been the day before, was all of a sudden, this was now complete Tsimshian. No more any kind of traditional non-native wedding. Now all the business was Tsimshian. And here is Mike. Notice that there is a lot of tattooing on the Northwest Coast, but not the kind of tattooing that just is anything. You get tattooed with your crest. It is your way to declare who you are in a permanent way. And they used to do that. There was tattooing in the past as well, so this is not a new sign. So here's Mike coming in full regalia, wearing the kind of abalone earrings that were so popular in the 19th century, shaking a rattle and singing. And I'll just go through some slides. There was a carving that was dedicated at the event, and so here you have a lot. And what's really interesting is that you have a lot of young people. That's one really nice thing, because a lot of young people on the Northwest Coast are really embracing their traditions in a way that is extremely gratifying to see for the old people as well as for people who love the culture. Then we have lots of dancing. Everyone is sitting around, and there's lots of dancing. Here's some more. And you can see how much regalia there is. That a lot of work went into this. Equally colorful to the celebration. These dancers very often go to celebration because they live a ferry ride away from Juneau. This is the beautiful Machiel, dressed in her regalia, dancing. And Patty, this is the best photograph of her. I just love this, and you get a sense. This is a woman that was wearing the white wedding gown the other day, and now she belongs so easily to. It's not that there are two worlds. There's one world, and it's just everything that she feels comfortable with. Her identity is universal in a very interesting way. Just wanted to show you one of the drums that Mike made, and he gave some drums away to important people. At various times during the proceedings, they would give gifts to various people who had participated at the, in the wedding. There were so many people. I mean, the aunts, uncles, friends, lots and lots of people had helped them. So they took this opportunity. You know, in a non-native wedding, the guests come and give gifts, right? But in a native wedding, the hosts give money to everybody, or give goods to everybody. And here they are thanking and giving gifts. And then this is, because I made the wedding cake, I got some gifts. And here is Michael and Mike. And here I am with my stack of gifts that I got from making the wedding cake. And Patty got a stack of gifts as well. So we were both paid properly, because the cake was my gift to her. That was my wedding gift to her, and yet she also paid us. So I think this is a really good conclusion to show that in some cases you have performances that are celebrating culture, and some celebrating history, and some celebrating a family. And here you have a range of contemporary celebrations that bring, I think, it all together. So, does anyone have any questions? I've exhausted you. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I will see you next week, if those of you who can come. Thanks a lot.